So, how do you find the low-end sweet spot in your room? What's the difference between bass traps and panels? Can you get rid of speaker-bound interference by moving your speakers into the corners against the front wall? All that and much more in this week's segment of the YouTube Questions Knowledge Bomb. Hey, what's up? It's Jesko again from AcousticSinsider.com, where I teach home studio acoustic treatment techniques for audio professionals, but without all the voodoo. So you know the drill. This is the segment where I answer your questions from the YouTube comments, because I just don't get in there often enough. I'll try and link all the videos that the questions are based on in the cards so that you can check them out if you're interested. With that, let's get into the first question. This one is by Made in Machines on a video called Frequency Response. What's a good response in a treated room? And he asks, so disappointing that this is a reality. You can spend thousands of pounds and still have a terrible frequency response. How are you supposed to mix properly? You will end up agonizing over precision 1 dB movements in volume and EQ when your room has 5 to 10 decibel swings. It seems pointless. Well, yeah, it might seem pointless, but that's the reality of things. And in fact, and in practice, you can totally make good judgments on what you're listening to, even with all those swings. Because this isn't like electronics. Your brain doesn't need a technically flat frequency response in order to assess where certain frequencies or volumes deviate from that flat line. Your brain is perfectly capable of learning the response over time that it hears, and you actually get used to what you're hearing. You kind of build a mental picture of it, and you can still make very, very precise assessments, even if the frequency response isn't flat. In fact, it's never actually ever going to be flat. So you could take that as proof. How would all these great songs have been mixed if the mixing engineers weren't capable of working with these kinds of variable frequency responses, let's say. Yeah, so I get your frustration, but the fact is that you can still totally work with this, and in fact, it's never going to be any different. This is the reality of things. But good question. Moving on. So this one is from Z12 on a video called Why Your 70 Hertz Null Won't Go Away Even with Bass Traps. And he says, Jesko, good to see you here again. I did your bass trap course. It was my big inspiration. At this moment, I'm building my traps, all of them 8-inch Rockwell. There are going to be 25 in my studio. After installing 21 panels now, the small studio room sounds already incredible. The stereo and detail sounds like a headphone, and I haven't even measured anything yet. I will keep you informed about this project. Thanks for all the research and time you put into this. Thank you for that comment. And also just thanks for letting people know. I wanted to show this to you watching this video so you understand that it is totally possible to get a great result in a small room. Yeah? You just have to focus on the essentials, get those big lever movements right, those big lever steps right, and you can totally take even a small room from untreated, totally unworkable, all the way to sounding really, really great. Yeah, so obviously this isn't a question, but I just wanted to throw that in there. And if you are interested in the Build a Better Bass Trap course, I'll have it linked below, and you can obviously find it on my website under the courses tab as well. Moving on, this one is by Mares056 on a video called Why Your 70 Hertz Null Won't Go Away Even with Bass Traps, so the same video. And he says, good to see you back. Thank you. I'm still learning about room acoustics and where acoustic panels are needed. In the impulse response measurement for my LCR, I get a peak right around the 3 millisecond and 5 millisecond marks for all three speakers. I'm thinking this is a ceiling reflection because the sidewalls are fairly treated, but the ceiling is not treated at all. What are your thoughts about this? It could be a number of things, yeah, but the quick way to assess what particular surface might be causing this reflection is just to do some simple maths. Yeah, so sound travels roughly 1 foot every millisecond, or about a meter every 3 milliseconds. Yeah, so a peak in the impulse response at 3 milliseconds will have traveled 3 feet or about 1 meter more than the direct sound. Okay, so if you know the distance between your speaker and your measurement microphone position, then you just add the travel distance of this delay time on top of that, and that gives you the total path length that this reflection will have traveled. So let's say you are about 1 meter, 3 feet away from your speakers, a fairly compact stereo setup, and you see a peak at 3 milliseconds. So that means the sound will have traveled another 3 feet on top of the 3 feet from the speaker to your measurement microphone. So a total travel distance of about 6 feet. And so the surface that this reflection bounces off of has to be at a distance where that total travel distance is about 6 feet. So about 3 feet there and 3 feet back. If your ceiling is that low, yeah, so basically not even 3 feet above the speakers, then it is potentially your ceiling. But that's unlikely, right? So it's more likely that it is something closer than that. Think about it, yeah? Which of your surfaces, include the desk as well, is close enough so that you get an extra 3 feet of travel distance on top of your direct sound distance between the speaker and your measurement microphone position. Yeah. So that's a quick way to kind of guesstimate how far this particular surface is away where that reflection bounces off of. Yeah. Quick side note here, the desk usually shows up within 1 millisecond because the path of the reflection isn't very much longer than the direct sound. Yeah, so that's why it usually happens somewhere around the 1 millisecond mark, often below that, or like even closer to the direct sound, yeah, under 1 millisecond. Yeah, but so that's how you can think about this, and you can get an idea of what potentially might be causing that reflection. Good question. Moving on, another one by Made in Machines on the video, can you actually overdamp a home studio? The science says no. And he says, what is the purpose of diffusion then, and why do so many people use scatter plates on their bass traps? So diffusion, pure diffusion, in my opinion, basically doesn't really have a place in a small home studio. The practical limitations of treating a home studio mean that you need to work with a tool that does more than a simple quadratic residue diffuser, for example. Yeah, because these tend to work in the mids, and you, in a small room, you really want to use all your available space for bass trapping, aka deep porous absorption. Yeah, and that means you can't really use diffusion. It's just kind of the wrong tool for the job. Yeah, it's kind of like saying you want to use a fork to eat a soup. Yeah, it doesn't mean that it doesn't work. A fork is a great tool. Diffusers work, but they're not the right tool for the purpose of treating a small home studio. Yeah, scatter plates, slightly different. Yeah, you're introducing scattering. It's a very simplified version of diffusion. Yeah, so it doesn't work quite as well as fully designed quadratic residue or primitive root diffusers, but they still help scatter sound, and they usually work in a higher part of the spectrum. Yeah, so usually somewhere between 2 and 5 kilohertz. And that can just simply help to give the room a sense of liveliness. Yeah, so it's not about how that affects the sound from the speakers. It's simply about how it affects your personal subjective perception of the room while you're in it. And that's where they can really help. They can help keep the room lively from a subjective sensation point of view, which just makes the room more comfortable to be in. Yeah, so that's kind of what the point of scatter plates is. I call them diffuser fronts in the Build a Better Bass Trap course. By the way, in there, I'll also show you how to design and build your own version of these scatter plates or diffuser fronts. Yeah, but so that's kind of the purpose of that. It's the icing on the cake. It's not really something that has or contributes as a fundamental part of the treatment of a small home studio. Good question. Moving on. This next one is by Arvs on a video called ChatGPT versus Professional Acousticians. Can AI match human expertise? And he says, would be awesome to see another one of these since these language models have been updated a lot since. Yeah, so I can give you a quick update on that. So I've been working a lot with AI to help me out with all the things that revolve around running Acoustics Insider. And I can confidently say that still to this point, the big LLMs, ChatGPT, Claude, whatever, are basically completely useless for treating or getting a plan to treat a home studio. The reason, as far as I can judge from the answers that it's giving me, is that there's so much misinformation, misguided information, just wrong information, not applicable information in the data sets that they train on, that it just basically gives poor advice. And then obviously on top of that, you get the hallucinations, which seem to not be getting any better. And sometimes it just returns complete crap. For example, I can't remember exactly what I tried the other day, but it basically said that windows were great diffusers. And I mean, it doesn't get worse than that, really. Yeah, I mean, that's an absolute no-brainer. But it made a very convincing argument, which was obviously completely wrong. Yeah. So to this point, you can't rely on any of the big large language models to help you get sensible information on acoustic treatment for home studios. This next one is by Lyron Hill Whirling on why your 70 hertz null won't go away even with bass traps. And he says, I've got one big question. I'm researching about acoustics for over 6 years now, and I'm pretty solid in terms of information about many aspects of acoustic treatment and physics behind it. But one point is not clear to me. Can bass frequencies, say below 100 hertz, even get reflected off a non-massive wall? So not a thick 40 centimeter brick wall, I mean a thinner, also thin insulated drywall. Let's say about 15 centimeters with some insulation inside. Physics would tell me that most of the energy produced by the speaker would pass through that wall. Only higher frequencies, so just everything over, say, 150 hertz or whatever, with less energy would get reflected. Am I right here? That's important for me to understand, because then I could narrow down where my 85 hertz dip comes from. Haha. Thank you, Jiske, for your great work. Keep it up. Thank you for the question. So it's not as black and white as that, right? It's not a matter of will it pass through completely or get reflected fully. It is a question of to what extent will the energy get reflected. Some of it will pass through and some of it will get reflected. The ratio of those two is obviously determined by the thickness, the exact material, how it's mounted, whether there's insulation behind it, all these variables that are part of the design of that reflecting surface. And that's kind of what makes it really difficult as well to assess this with any accuracy. Yeah. That said, I don't think it'll help you understand where your 85 hertz dip comes from. You can expect even single layers of drywall to reflect some of the energy in the low frequencies. If your entire 4 walls plus ceiling are made of single layer drywall, maybe a different question, but that's usually not the case. To decide or to assess where which effect is causing an 85 hertz dip, you really need to start from the basics up, right? So there are basically 3 potential causes. Yeah? It's either a room mode dip, just as you're thinking. It's possibly a speaker boundary interference effect. So this is a reflection to a surface and back to the speaker, which is why you won't get a peak in the impulse response, by the way, if you're measuring this with Room EQ Wizard, for example. Or it's a standard mirror point reflection. Yeah, so I call mirror point reflections because they are the reflections where the energy returns to the listening position, in contrast to speaker boundary interference, as I just said, where it returns back to the speaker and interferes at the speaker membrane. Yeah. And obviously these reflections you can track with the mirror test, which is why I call them mirror point reflections. Those are your standard reflections that we talk about usually in acoustics. Yeah. Any one of those can potentially cause an 85 hertz dip. And so it's a matter of systematically testing which of these potential effects is causing that dip and basically eradicating them as an option. Yeah. And so you narrow it down until you actually find the cause for that dip. You also always have to remember that it might be caused by more than one effect. Yeah. Remember, the resulting frequency response that you see is all the effects in your room, all the acoustic effects piled on top of each other and squished into a single number. Yeah. And so if you see a dip, there's no reason why there might not be two effects that are simply aligned in frequency and actually sit on top of each other. Yeah. So one of the reasons why you might see, if you start treating your room and you actually track the process with measurements, that you might see a peak in one measurement turning into a dip in the next measurement, which can be really confusing. Yeah. The reason is that you probably got rid of one effect, but not the other one. And they were actually either compensating each other in your original measurement, or one was dominating the other one. And if you get rid of the dominating one, the other one pops up. Yeah. And so you always have to remember that it's not necessarily just one effect that is causing a particular dip. Yeah. It can be, but it can also not be. And that's where things get really confusing. Yeah. One of the reasons why I promote my shotgun approach to treating rooms. Yeah. It's so much more effective and efficient to simply treat the room based off of first principles, where you really attack all the effects that you expect to happen in theory, and only then do you actually measure, for example, and try and track down anything that remains. Yeah, because in an untreated room, it is basically impossible to try and dissect the measurements until you get a complete picture of all the effects that are happening. It's possible, but it is extremely difficult, and it is extremely time consuming. And for anybody who doesn't do this regularly, it's basically an impossible job. Yeah. So it's just not an effective approach if you're DIYing your acoustics to try and go down that path, because it's not going to lead anywhere useful. Yeah. Anyway, slight tangent there. Good question. Let's move on to the next question. This one is from Far Water Records on the video Why Your Studio's RT60 measurement is Lying to You. He says, there is really nothing wrong with the fact that RT60 is not suitable for small rooms. That's just a limitation of the metric itself. The good news is that there are other graphs that much more accurately reflect the real acoustic situation. Room EQ Wizard already provides them, for example, EDT, T20, T30. These measurements work far better in small spaces and give a much clearer picture of what's actually happening in the room. That's exactly right. And that's why I wanted to highlight this comment. Obviously, we don't just give up on the time aspect of measurements just because RT60 isn't a good metric to use. Instead, we use other metrics to track the time response of the room, the decay of the room. Yeah. And so, for example, EDT, T20, T30, these are all measures that we take off of the impulse response or the energy time curve. Yeah. And we can use those to look at different segments of the frequency response, for example. We can also look at the exact shape that we are actually getting. So it's not just the number that T30, for example, gives us, but we can look at the actual shape of the impulse response, which will tell us certain things about how the room is constituted, whether there are, for example, adjacent rooms, adjacent reverb spaces, verby spaces that work together, all these things. Yeah. So the real information in all measurements is you get the real picture in proper acoustic measurements by looking at all the different graphs together. They all show you a different angle of the same picture, right? And so you're kind of looking at it from this angle and then looking at it from this angle, and then you're looking at it from behind and from the top, yeah, sort of. And by putting all that together, that's when you get a complete picture of what is actually happening in the room, and in particular, obviously, in the measurements. Yeah, good comment. This next one is by Skatepark02 on the video called Confusing Speaker Placement Tips and How to Deal with Them. He says, considering the speaker boundary interference response, SBIR, why not have the speakers as far back as possible into the corners of the front wall? Surely that would make the out of phase element of the boundary response move as high as possible up the spectrum. I have done something similar in that I've placed mine as close to my corner traps as I can. The stands create an unavoidable gap of a few inches, and so far this has been my best speaker placement. Yes, but the theory of this comment is completely true. Yeah, by moving the speakers closer to the surface that is causing speaker boundary interference, you're moving the out of phase component up in the spectrum, and so it doesn't cause any more problems in the low frequencies. But if your room is too big to do that, let's say your front wall is 10 feet behind your speakers, you'll end up with a gigantic stereo triangle, and that potentially is too big for the impact of the room to not destroy what you're getting, even with treatment. Yeah, and the problem being that you might lose your stereo image and your phantom center if you move your speakers too far away from your listening position. Yeah, so that's why in the phantom speaker test course, by the way, which you can get for free, also linked below, the priority isn't to optimize your speaker placement to some surface because of something that you see in a measurement. The priority when setting up your speakers is to get a proper stereo image and a solid phantom center, because you need that in order to mix music properly. If you don't have a proper stereo soundstage, because your speakers are too far apart, because they're too far away, for whatever reason, if your brain can't construct a proper stereo soundstage in terms of psychoacoustics, you won't be able to hear the music and make proper judgment. You can, however, perfectly compensate for a potential dip caused in the frequency response caused by speaker bound interference. It's a nuisance, but it won't stop you from working, while losing your stereo image will stop you from working. Yeah? So it's a matter of priorities. It's not a matter of right or wrong. It's a matter of what to prioritize in order to get a functioning system. Yeah? So that said, if your room allows you to do that, great. And actually the phantom speaker test will show you how to assess that properly so you can make an educated decision on whether you're able to move your speakers that far back and into the corners. Yeah? Anyway, good comment, good question. Moving on. This one is from Panama Lewis on the video called 3 things equals 80% of your studio sound. Most people do 0 of them. And he says, which one of your courses on your website teaches on how to locate the low end sweet spot? Yeah, good question. Let me take that opportunity to show to you. Obviously, I'll link it down in the description. It's always linked in the description. It's part of the phantom speaker test mini course, if you will. It's completely free. Or you can go to my website and it's right here at the top. It's basically any button that you can click to a free workshop will lead you there, right? So it's the phantom speaker test free workshop. And the first step in the process is how to find the low end sweet spot. I call it the bass hunter technique originally. Here it's called the low end sweet spot method, but it's basically a simple test on assessing your room's room mode response in order to identify where the ideal listening position is in your room. Yeah. So it's in there. Again, it's completely for free. You can sign up and it'll walk you through that process of using your ears and just some music. Within an hour or two, you should be able to do this to assess your room's low-end response, figure out where you potentially have low-end sweet spots. Most rooms have maybe 1 or 2, yeah, and that's where your listening position goes. And then as a second step, you use the phantom speaker test to actually place your speakers and make sure you get that stereo soundstage and that phantom center. Okay, so this next one basically is a follow-up question to the same we just looked at. Rome8180 on the same video asks, can you do a follow-up video on how to find the bass sweet spot? My issue is I have an oddly shaped room and there are only so many places it would make sense to put a desk. Also, I have a ton of gear in the room, so it'd be a bit of a logistical nightmare to try every spot in the room. I suppose I could briefly set up my speakers facing every wall and see what happens. So yeah, again, sign up to the free course. It'll show you in all the detail what you need to do in order to figure this out. But in a nutshell, it works like this. You basically put your speaker, one speaker, on the floor in a corner. That will, to the largest extent, excite all the room modes in the room, create a worst case scenario of room mode interference, which in turn makes it as easy as possible to actually hear what's going on and where you have dips and large peaks at which locations in the room. And then you basically choose central axes in your room that even come into question because they offer you left-right symmetry. Yeah. If your room doesn't give you left-right symmetry across the entire room, pick a section of the room, an end of the room where you have mostly left-right symmetry. Then you split that in half. That's your central axis. Then you sit in your chair that you use when you're sitting at your setup, when you're listening to your speakers. You've put your speaker in a corner, left, right, in front of you. Play some music that you know well, and that's important. You need to have an intuitive way of judging what the low end needs to sound like. And that's best done by just listening to music with a solid bass line, for example, something that maybe plays a good melody, isn't just like a single note bass, like in techno or something. And that you know really well, so that when you then roll backwards and forwards in your chair, start right at the front of the wall, that'll give you the worst type of accentuation of bass. You'll get the most bass boost at the wall. That will give you a reference of what is too much bass. Then you start rolling back on that central axis until you find a spot where the bass disappears completely. That is your second reference point. That is, again, worst case, not enough, not like basically zero bass, as little as your room might give you. And that will give you the two extremes. And now you can start narrowing it down in between until you find a spot where the low end in that song that you know well sounds like you would expect it to sound. And you do that with a few pieces of music, and then you just make a solid guesstimation of where that averages out and where that spot is. And that is your low end sweet spot. And that is where your listening position needs to go. You mark that with an X on the floor, put some tape down or whatever. That's where your head needs to be. Once everything is set up, your head needs to be above the X, above that spot on the floor. And so then you start putting everything in front of you, obviously between you and the front wall, and that's the space you have available. If you've got a lot of gear, there's no magic here. It's a pick your poison situation. Yeah, you need to decide whether sound is a priority or your gear is a priority. Yeah, there's no magic here. You simply have to make a decision. I prioritize sound, and usually in terms of gear, the simple advice is put only the gear in front of you that you need to access all the time. Everything else can go beside you in floor racks. And that way they don't interfere with the sound from your speakers. Yeah, that's why mastering studios often look the way they do. Yeah, so that's how this works. And again, if you want to check that out in full detail, it's a free video course with a lot more detail, a lot more explanation on how to go through this, linked in the description. Here's another comment on the same video that I just wanted to read out to you from Zootook3422. And he says, I guess Jesko has said this in several videos in the past, but this is really, really condensed version, a must-see. Thank you. I've followed these 3 points and I'm very happy with the result, even if I have budget gear mainly. The details I hear is way beyond all budget studios I've ever heard, and compares with pretty high-end mastering studios. The idea to let the sound dictate where you locate the desk and speakers is a tough one. You can't argue with room acoustics. Thank you, Jesko, for all the good advice. That's exactly right. Yeah, and that's why I wanted to show this to you. And again, also just to show you, you can get really good results if you focus on the essentials, on those steps that really make a difference, and you don't compromise on any of these because your desk is too big. Yeah, sorry, I've heard this too many times. Yeah, but don't put a huge desk in a tiny room. Figure out where your low and sweet spot is. Figure out where your speakers need to go by using the free Phantom Speaker Test course. And then you know how much space you have available for everything else that needs to go in the room. Yeah, that's simply the reality of it. And if you follow that process, you will get great sound. Yeah, it's just a matter of focusing on what actually matters and being able to compromise on the things that just aren't that important. And here's another follow-up that is quite interesting from Beat from Brain on the same video. How do you find the bass frequently sweet spot if you don't know where your speakers are going to be set up? In other words, is the bass frequency sweet spot going to be the same no matter where you play music from in the room? To a large extent, yes, because the low end sweet spot in the room is a spot where the pattern, the energy in the standing waves or room modes in your room balance out. And that is purely dictated by the geometry of your room. It does matter where you place your speakers, but not as much. And that's the important thing here again. It's a matter of priorities. You need to prioritize the low end balance determined by room modes before you start thinking about anything else, because that is the largest determining factor. Yeah. And again, because it is purely dictated by the room's size and geometry, that spot doesn't change. Once you found it, that's where you need to sit, and that's it. Yeah, you can then start messing around by setting up how you will. Yeah, obviously there are certain guidelines that you can follow in order to to narrow this down and actually find something that works. AKA, for example, focusing on that local symmetry. But the low end sweet spot doesn't change. And here, fun fact: once you found that, you've basically done all the work to include and to integrate a subwoofer if you want to do that further down the line. Because the subwoofer is simply going to pump more energy into that standing wave room mode pattern in your room. And if you've already identified the spot where that is balanced out, you can then put more energy into the system. And instead of it getting worse, you're simply getting more, right? And that's obviously what we want from a subwoofer, okay? So that's why I wanted to show this to you as well. So does that mean, as Chris Williams says on the same video, that having a choice of listening position seems like a luxury reserved for larger rooms? No. You basically never have a choice of listening positions. Even in larger rooms, you still have to go through the same process, because if the room is really large enough, very large, to the extent that you don't have to rely on balancing out room modes at your listening position anymore, or finding a listening position with a balanced room mode pattern, then you obviously have more choice. But we're talking about very large rooms here. Yeah. And so basically it's never a luxury, not even in bigger rooms. Yeah. To some extent, the more treatment you do, the more the standing waves are damped, the more low-end treatment you do, the more standing waves are damped, basically meaning that this effect of room modes becomes less and less. The less you become a slave to this pattern, and the more flexibility you gain. But this is kind of theoretical. In my experience and practice, this doesn't work. You want to find that listening position, that spot where the room modes balance out in the empty room so that it's easy to find, and then you want to stick to it forever. Yeah, it's not going to change unless you change the geometry of your space. Moving on. This one is from Kane D. Williams on the video. Can you actually overdamp a home studio? The science says no. He says, From your last few videos, I understand you can't have too much absorption, but you can have too much uneven absorption, with, say, the high end being absorbed more heavily than, say, the lower mids and bass. So you recommend lots of broadband absorption plus bass traps. My question is, aren't bass traps simply thicker panels to get them to absorb more lower frequency? Don't they continue to be broadband absorbers, still absorbing all the other frequencies? So in other words, how would one create unbalanced absorption? I get it that thin panels or foam panels would create an imbalance. Well, there's your answer. By only attenuating high frequencies, but if we place thick bass traps in corners and at reflection points, would those work as well or better than, say, 4-inch panels at reflection points and thick bass traps in corners? You basically answered your own question. First of all, bass traps are, as you just say, basically just broadband absorbers. They always also absorb mid and highs. The question isn't, do we get to absorb mids and highs? The question is, how low down can we get that thing to absorb? Yeah, so it basically starts at the top, and then at some point, depending on the thickness, it'll drop off in absorption towards the low end. And you want to increase that as far down as possible so that you get even absorption. Why you might still get an uneven absorption, unbalanced absorption, is, like you said, because you can't justify the use of space. So you need to use 2 inches on your ceiling because it's so low down and you don't want to sacrifice that space. And your room might already initially have an unbalanced response in terms of the decay times, reverb times. Yeah, I'll link the video where I talked about this in more detail. The point being is that you're starting off unbalanced in most small rooms. So longer decays in the lows, usually already short decays in the highs and mids. So you're starting unbalanced, and then you stick more thin panels in the room on top of that. It gets even worse. And now you got a real problem. Yeah, and that's why you need to put in deep broadband absorber bass traps. So you want to go as deep as possible everywhere, in a nutshell. And that will give you the best chance of evening out that potentially already uneven reverb time. On top of that, I talked about that before, you can add scattering, which gives you the perception of liveliness in the high end, and the high mids, high end. Yeah, and that will also counteract the effect or the impression that a room sounds dead, even though you might not have a perfect balanced decay time across the spectrum. Yeah, so it's those two: deep absorption plus scatter faces, scatter plates, diffuser fronts, which is the optimal tool to deal with this scenario, which is why that's exactly what I teach in the Build a Better Bass Trap course. Again, linked in the description. All right, only 2 more to go. This one is from Skatepark02 on the same video, why your studio's RT60 measurement is lying to you. He says, the question is, at what dimensions is a room no longer considered small? Or is that defined by how problematic the room modes are? Yes. From an acoustics perspective, basically a room is considered small if it has room modes. Yeah, so if it's small enough to create resonances, standing waves in the audible spectrum, it's basically a small room. Yeah, basically all the rooms that we're working with are small rooms. Not small rooms are concert halls, theaters, yeah, stadiums. Those are not small rooms. Anything that we're talking about, it's all small rooms. Yeah, even the big rooms are still small rooms, acoustically speaking, because the wavelengths still fit between the major dimensions and can still create standing waves, room modes. Yeah, good question. All right, one final one here from KG1234 minus P6I. On 3 things equals 80% of your studio sound, what most people do, why most people do 0 of them. He says, what constitutes a low-end sweet spot? How do you account for it? By what measure? Loudness, thump, or something else? Yeah, so it's, like I said before, it's where the room modes balance out, but that's a fairly technical description. An easier or more subjective description is where you get chest bass, which is kind of the upper bass, and low-end thump in your stomach. And it's these two that you want to hear, both of them. You don't want an extreme or one or the other. And that's kind of the best way, in my opinion, to assess, or to give you it's not the best way, but it's a simple way to assess whether you are on target. Yeah? There are obviously timing aspects to all of this, but I would prioritize this aspect of low end thump versus upper bass punch. Yeah, and if you get those two right, that's a good indicator that you've found your low end sweet spot. All right, that's the final question for this video. I hope you enjoyed that. Again, all the links to everything that we've talked about are in the description on acousticsinsider.com as well. I hope you enjoyed this lightning round. With that, as always, let's get back to learning to trust our ears and having fun making music in the studio. I'll see you in the next video.